I can tell you're already a very polite audience because the room went quiet as I approached the podium. It's always a good sign. Thank you very kindly for being here this evening. And I'd like to welcome you to Research Matters Big Thinking Panel. I'm George Dixon. I'm a professor of biology and vice president for research at the University of Waterloo. I'm also part of the university-wide coalition behind Research Matters. And I'm pleased that we're having this convention here today to talk about what it really means for researchers and actually for society in general to think big. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are visitors on traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples, and I'd like to thank them for welcoming us onto their territories today. I would also like to thank and welcome the Honourable Dr. Elizabeth Dodswell, the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, to our event, as well as the gold medal winners of the GTAH Science Fair. Are they here? Can they sort of raise their hands if they're all over here? It's always good to have the next generation of university researchers in the audience, so welcome. As you're probably aware, my home city of Waterloo prides itself on being a hub of technological innovation. We have about 30,000 people in the Waterloo region that work in the high-tech industry, and there are more than 1,000 technology-based companies within Waterloo region. You'd expect that our university, the University of Waterloo, is tapped into that world of applied science and technology, and you'd be right. We devote significant resources to helping researchers within the university turn new ideas into new products. This is a huge way that our university contributes to the regional, provincial, and national economy. Having said that, it is most definitely not the only way. If all we did was encourage our faculty and students to develop new patents and new products, we'd be heading down a dead end, and we'd be failing in our mandate to fulfill the society mandate of a university. Innovation also relies on research aimed not at merely solving immediate and obvious problems, but also of exploring larger issues or bigger questions. That type of research and scholarship goes by a number of different names, and the names keep changing, but basically you can call it discovery research, you can call it curiosity-driven research, you can call it knowledge creation, it's also called pure research or frankly just exploration. No matter what you label it, it is the type of research where the outcome and the implications of the research activity are not inherently obvious when you initiate the work. Some of them usually are, but often the most important ones aren't. It's research that involves asking questions that might take decades to answer. Frankly, I've seen some research looking at questions where it's not quite obvious that we're ever going to find an answer, but the questions evolve and then we do actually find an answer to the question as it evolves. This type of research is probably the most valuable from a societal perspective. It involves taking risks, challenging limitations, and pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. Curiosity-driven research gives us the stuff that we could never have imagined until it actually appears. If you had tried to envision a smartphone 50 years ago, you probably would have had difficulty doing that. But the fundamental research that led to the information and computer technology tsunami of activity that led to the smartphone was ongoing in 50 years ago, but people had no clue that the smartphone was going to be the outcome of that research activity. Today we are going to talk about just a few of the ideas that have changed the way we think and improved the way we live, we work, and we play. We're going to look at what are the current big thinking questions that we should be addressing. Our moderator, Marcy Ian, who is, I believe, right over here. Welcome, Marcy. We'll introduce today's speakers, but first it's my job to tell you a bit about what I'll call the broader game-changing ideas. Try saying that 3 times quickly. Game-Changing Ideas project as part of the ongoing mission to connect Ontario University research with everyday life. The Research Matters Initiative has curated a list of 50 game-changing ideas that have emerged from research here in the province. The 50 game-changing ideas cover a wide range of fields from technology, medicine, art, history, biology, literary criticism, quantum physics, and much more. As part of today's conversation, we're launching a contest where you and everyone else in the province actually can vote on what you think is the biggest game-changing idea that's set within these 50. Frankly, there's probably a lot more than 50, but we had to come down to 50, and I think we started with about 175 and whittled it down to 50. The contest will run throughout the summer, and you can vote for your favorites starting right now at youruniversityresearch.ca or yourontarioresearch.ca. We will announce the Ontario's favorite discoveries in September. Before we begin celebrating our historic game-changing research discoveries, I'd like to introduce you to someone who I think is well on her way to being a member of the next generation of game-changing researchers. Robin McEwen is completing a master's degree in social work at Carleton University, and she's looking at trying to apply her findings on vulnerable children and youth in foster care to improving policies and support programs within that space. She is also one of Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council's top 5 storytellers for 2014. The Top 5 Storytellers competition runs annually, and it challenges post-secondary students to show Canadians how social sciences and humanities research is affecting our lives, our world, and trying to improve our future for the better. Following Robin's presentation, Stephen Toop, who is president of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences and director of the U of T's Munk School of Global Affairs, will introduce our moderator for the evening. Stephen is sitting right over here. I'd like to thank the Federation for co-sponsoring this event with us this evening. As I say, welcome, and please join me in welcoming Robin McEwen.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Robin McEwen. I've actually just finished my master's in social work at Carleton University, and I'm going to tell you a bit about my research. So I used to work in the field of social work in Vancouver, and a big part of my job was to find foster homes for children and youth who can no longer live with their families. Now, some kids are easier to find homes for than others, but today I want to tell you about one girl. We'll call her Carly. And she's what we in the field call a hard-to-house youth. Now, Carly was a 17-year-old Aboriginal girl. She had fetal alcohol syndrome. She struggled with addiction, and she lived in 10 foster family homes and group homes since she came into care at the age of 13. Now, most of these homes were set up as temporary placements, and so here her care team was, yet again, sitting around a table talking about finding Carly a new home. A care team is essentially a social support network comprised of paid professionals. I was on Carly's care team to help her find a new foster home. She had a mental health worker to help her deal with her history of abuse, an Aboriginal worker, someone who helps her stay connected to her culture. She has group home staff, the people who get her to and from school every day, help her with her homework. She has a big care team, a lot of people around her. She walks into this room, sits down at the table and says, "You know what? I'm 17 now. When I turn 19, you're gone, you're gone, you're gone, you're gone. I'm alone in this world, and I need you guys to find me a family." It's kids like Carly who made me realize the importance of researching the devastating effects of youth aging out of the foster care system and having all social supports fall away. Carly knew that whatever home I found for her, In 2 years, she'd begin her transition to adulthood. She'd have to move yet again, and she'd have to prepare to lose the only social supports that she knows, and that's her care team. Now, there's a few things we know about kids raised in the foster care system. Less than half of them graduate from high school. Close to half of them become homeless at some point in their lives, and over 70% of youth raised in foster care come into contact with the criminal justice system. What my research seeks to unpack is the social support network of these youth after they leave foster care. Who do they turn to in times of need? Who can they call for support? For the past year, I was interviewing former youth in care to get their side of the story about what this experience was like for them. And what my participants tell me is that when they leave the system, they feel they're expected to rely largely on themselves. Kids raised in foster care often have the most tumultuous upbringings, and yet they're expected to be completely independent sooner than youth raised in biological family contexts. What my research is showing is that we need to change the system that's in place right now for foster kids. We need to work towards finding relationships of permanency and placements of permanency for youth in care so they have a better chance at a successful future after they leave the foster care system. Thank you.
Votre honneur, invités distingués, mesdames et messieurs, bonsoir et merci pour votre présence. Robin, thank you so much for delivering that heartfelt presentation, really bringing awareness to the importance of social support networks for youth in foster care. It seems to me to be a clear example of how the next generation of researchers is undertaking work that really is vital to the health and social development of Ontario and indeed of Canada. I'm Stephen Toop, and I have the privilege of being a jury member for the upcoming 2015 edition of the SSHRC's important storyteller competition, and I look forward to it immensely. And we've just seen why. I wish you, Robin, every success in your continuing work. Thank you as well, Professor Dixon. I'm here as president of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences, and I want to welcome all of you this evening. Je suis très heureux de vous accueillir à cet événement ce soir. The Federation is the national organization and public policy advocate for Canada's scholars, students, and practitioners in the humanities and social sciences. Our membership comprises over 160 universities, colleges, and associations, and we represent a diverse community of 85,000 researchers and graduate students across Canada. The Federation is delighted to have partnered with the Council of Ontario Universities under this Research Matters initiative to bring big thinking to today's agenda. Now, Big Thinking is a lecture series that the Federation is proud to have sponsored for almost 2 decades. Typically, the Big Thinking series takes place on Parliament Hill, where it runs approximately every month when the House and the Senate are in session. The series offers parliamentarians and other decision makers in Ottawa insights from current research on some of the most pressing public policy issues that we face. And it demonstrates the critical contribution of scholarly research to the policy development process. But it's nice to escape from Ottawa. So several times a year, we take Big Thinking on the road, seizing every opportunity to bring leading researchers to other important events across Canada. And today we're pleased to be here in Toronto for the Ontario Research Week. The Federation also brings Big Thinking to our annual Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences, where over 8,000 of Canada's leading researchers across the social science and humanities disciplines engage with each other, with diverse stakeholders, and with the public to discuss the latest research and its applicability to our world. Congress, now in its 84th year, will take place this year at the University of Ottawa in the spring, and I hope that many of you will join us. The Federation is grateful to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council for their continued support of Big Thinking on the Hill, on the road, and at the Congress. Which brings me to tonight's Big Thinking event. As co-sponsors with the Council of Ontario Universities, our intent from the outset is to celebrate game-changing researchers who work right here in Ontario, but who have positive repercussions in their work across Canada, indeed across the globe. While the Council of Ontario Universities contest, which you heard about from George earlier, which allows the public to pick their favorite game-changing discoveries, is still underway, tonight we have 3 such examples to showcase to you. But there's no attempt to sway your votes, so you're still completely at liberty to vote for whatever project you think is most exciting. The 3 researchers that we're going to hear from tonight represent well the varied and vital contributions of Canada's academics, which go well beyond the realm of advancing scholarship, as important as that is. We know that research at its best can have profound impact upon our communities, our society, the economy, on policy. I don't want you just to take my word for it or even the academics' word for it. Tonight, we'll be treated not only to the insights from leading researchers you've seen on the agenda, but to a discussion with members from civil society who will offer firsthand their insights on how these research discoveries actually bring change to people's lives here in Ontario and outside. I'm certain that you're going to be very interested in what they have to say. Tonight, we're very fortunate to have Marcy Ian with us to moderate Big Thinking, and I'm delighted to introduce her. Ms. Ian is someone who probably is familiar to many of you since she's co-host of Canada AM, CTV's national morning show. Ms. Ian's work has taken her across Canada from Halifax, where she joined the CTV National News as a reporter in 1997, to Vancouver, where I saw her when she was news anchor for CTV's Olympic Morning at the 2010 Vancouver Olympics. In 2010, Ms. Ian was recipient of the Black Business and Professional Association's Woman of Honor Award. She's traveled to Sierra Leone on behalf of Journalists for Human Rights, and has been honored for her dedication to children's charities, including World Vision. Ms. Ian sits on the board of DARE Arts, a Canadian not-for-profit organization that uses arts education to empower children to become leaders, and she's on the advisory program for Centennial College's journalism program. I'd like to call Marcy Ian and our 3 researchers and civil society spokespeople all to the stage now, and I am delighted to pass the podium over to Marcy Ian. Thank you, and please join me in welcoming our panelists this evening.
I'll let the gentlemen seat themselves. What an esteemed group. It's my privilege to be here. Good evening, everybody. How are you? Fine. Hello? What is a game changer? So I was thinking about that. Passion, persistence, patience, and immediately, because of the term game changer, I thought sports analogy, and when it comes to sports, I think basketball first. So here's the analogy. DeMar DeRozan, or Kyle Lowry of the Toronto Raptors, one of them has the ball. 4th quarter, couple seconds left, they're down by 2, they need a 3-point shot. The game changer gets that ball. It is going to Kyle, it is going to DeMar, because they always, one or the other, get it done. We are surrounded and privileged to be surrounded by game changers this evening, people making a huge difference, and as it was said, in how we work, how we play, how we see the world. We are making a difference not only in this province but across the country, in people's lives from day to day. And what's interesting about this discussion tonight is that we will see the practical side of this too, how this innovative, game-changing research impacts everyday lives. We'll have a frank discussion, and we hope that you'll be ready with questions as well at the end of the evening. So here's how it's going to go down, ladies and gentlemen. I'll introduce all three researchers and then the three members of civil society who will tell us how that research is impacting their lives and how they work. Each researcher will tell us a little bit about their research. We've given them about 10 minutes or so. It's hard to encapsulate all that brilliance into 10 minutes. We're going to try. 10 to 12 minutes or so, and then we're going to turn it over to that member of civil society to tell us more about the impact on them. And then once we've heard from all six, we're going to have an armchair. How apropos. Lovely armchairs that we have. Hello, Kent. We are going to have an armchair discussion. One of the panelists said, this kind of looks Oprah-ish. Yes, it does. I won't make you cry, and I'm not giving you a car. But we will have an armchair discussion about various aspects that come up. So I will be taking notes as the gentlemen speak and maybe ask the questions that you're thinking. And if I've left anything out, then feel free to participate at the end in the Q&A, and you can see that microphones have been set up for just that purpose. Social media matters, and it matters in a big way. So for those of you following the conversation at home or watching from home, we encourage you to tweet us. Tweet us a question. We'd love for you to do that. The handle is @OntarioResearch, all one word, @OntarioResearch, and the hashtag is Research Matters. So we welcome the social media component. Please tweet us, get involved that way, and we'll maybe try and use a question or two later from that aspect of everything. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. Gerald McMaster is a curator, an artist, an author, and professor of Indigenous visual cultural and critical curatorial studies at OCAD University. And he's going to be speaking to us tonight about revolutionizing Canadian art through the Group of Seven. It's so very interesting. I had a chance to speak to Gerald for a couple of minutes earlier today, and he used a great phrase. He said, we're indigenizing, I love that, we're indigenizing various institutions. And I said, that's a great line. So we'll hear more about that. He'll tell us how the Group of Seven members influenced the next generation of Canadian artists. Even today, many see the Group of Seven's art as a symbol of our identity, our Canadian identity, our unique identity. Gerald received his PhD at the University of Amsterdam School of Cultural Analysis, Theory and Interpretation, and indeed was just getting off a plane when I spoke to him last night and again today. And we were able to speak. He travels a lot. His expertise is sought out all over the world. Following Gerald's presentation, we'll hear from Kent Monkman. And Kent is a Canadian artist of Cree ancestry who works with various mediums, many of them including painting, film, video, installation, performance. He has had solo exhibitions at numerous Canadian museums. He's right across this country, including the Museum of Fine Art in Montreal, the Museum of Contemporary Canadian Art here in Toronto, the Winnipeg Art Gallery, the Art Gallery of Hamilton, and participated in various international group exhibitions as well. Then on to Michael Geist, law professor at the University of Ottawa, where he holds the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce law. Tonight, Michael will be focusing on leading the public response to changes to Canada's copyright laws in 2007. And when we spoke briefly, Michael was explaining how the U.S. copyright laws were changing rapidly 10 years ago, and how Canada had to find its way and actually make its mark at that time. Very, very interesting. Michael lobbied for more user-oriented provisions in a digital age, leading the Supreme Court to cite his work on reconciling creator and user rights in several of its copyright decisions. The Modernized Copyright Act of Canada now takes users into account in everything from educational users of copyright works to creation of user-generated content. Michael received his doctorate in law from Columbia Law School. He teaches and of course is a researcher, and because, he's a slouch and hasn't done enough, Michael also is a syndicated columnist on technology law issues, a regular column appearing in the Toronto Star as well as the Hill Times. Brent Rowe is a university librarian at Laurentian University, and Brent is going to respond after Michael and tell us how his work has really impacted him, how Michael's work has impacted him, how it impacts his work life, and how he goes about doing his daily duties and responsibilities at Laurentian. So looking forward to hearing about that, Brent. Ron Deibert is a professor of political science and director of the Canada Centre for Global Security and Citizen Lab, and the Citizen Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. It was established in 2001, and the Citizen Lab conducts interdisciplinary research at the intersection of human rights, global security, and information, as well as communication technologies. Citizen Lab researchers have uncovered cyber espionage. We know how topical that is right now. They've discovered cyber espionage networks right around the world that literally target civil society and threaten human rights. So Michael's group interweaves all of this on a daily basis. Citizen Lab research reports are often the subject of world news, including having its reports covered on the pages, the front pages, I should say, of the New York Times and Washington Post 11 times over the past 7 years. Deibert has published numerous articles and chapters and books on issues related to technology and media and how these worlds often collide. He's been a consultant and advisor to numerous governments and international organizations and civil societies, NGOs. So impressive. Ugin, and I pronounced it correctly, right, Ugin? He showed me how. Told me how. Ugin Badahansang is Creative Director and Canada National Director for Students for a Free Tibet, an international organization with some 70,000 members worldwide, and that's in more than 50 countries. SFT Canada works to empower youth, and the young people are our future. So we're talking grassroots, and that's important. So to empower youth for social justice through the principles, and get this, it's non-violent direct action and civil disobedience modeled after Gandhi's movement. He's a full-time human rights campaigner, and Ugin holds a Bachelor in Visual Communications Design from OCAD University. His core project at OCAD University was the evolving design of protest, because it is ever-changing, highlighting major changes in social advocacy in the new age of social media. We're hearing about social media a lot tonight, and cell phones. Impressive panel. So without further ado, I'd like to call on Gerald McMaster, OCAD University, as well as Kent Monkman, artist, to speak. We'll start with you, Gerald.
Here we have projectile points. They're very small little pieces of arrowheads. There are blades of different sizes. They are arranged in a beautiful patterning. They're done by individuals thousands and thousands of years ago. They're from a particular part of Canada near here in Lake Erie. They're discovered by an archaeologist. They say that they can tell the history of Canada, 11,000 years of history in one particular place. They're beautiful works of art, something you probably see at a human history museum, a display by archaeologists or ethnologists, but this isn't an art museum. They're skillfully done. They are arranged in such a manner as to give you a sense of their history, their artistry, and the skill of the individual who created them. As I was putting an exhibition together, a very prominent curator who I worked with stopped me dead in my tracks and said, "Is this art?" And I go, "I don't know, I guess we got to prove it's art." These are ancient Aboriginal Indigenous works. Indigenous peoples had no word for art, but hey, this is the 21st century. We got to look at the world differently. They didn't do it that way in the past. Another question that I had when I came to the Art Gallery of Ontario as the new curator is, why have women and First Nations been silenced? Why have they been written out of history? I came to the Art Gallery of Ontario and I saw this wonderful, amazing building being built by Frank Gehry. Transformation AGO was called. When I was hired the first day or second day or third day, when I arrived, I was given a business card, my name on it. I was very proud of it. I turned it over and I saw 3 phrases: new building, new ideas, and new future. Man, was I proud. Was I ever excited? I thought, this is a place I want to work at. This is the place I've got to be. This is where things are going to change. But we've got to change things very rapidly. So what is it that we have to change? When I came, they asked me to rehang the Canadian galleries. And what is rehanging? Well, you might think it's just moving a few pictures around and, decorating a home. Yeah, it's that simple, but it's also very hard. Rehanging takes ideas, very, very strong ideas. We're also guided by various peoples in history. I remember reading somewhere in a book by William Faulkner who says the past is never dead. It's not even dead. There were other ideas that we thought about how do we bring the world into the present. We're guided by such ideas, as someone once said, that we experience the present through the lens of the past. And we shape our understanding of the present through the lens of the past. It was in art history that we often see, when you go to a museum, you see art history and you see the installations. They begin at the long time ago and they go through various periods of time, through the various isms until you arrive today. But we felt, how is it that we are going to make this place come alive? How is it that it needs to come alive? And we have to do something different. We have to answer some of these questions. So we started with very simple premises and looking at ideas. We boiled them down to 3 major ideas: myth, memory, power. And why 3 ideas? Well, it's harder to remember 4, 5, 6, 7 ideas, isn't it? 3 ideas is pretty easy to remember. So you walk out the gallery, if I told you, what's that exhibition all about? You would say it's about myth, memory, power. But we also had to figure out how this exhibition was going to come to be. We also had to realize that it had to be in the present moment. It had to have many voices. It had to be multivocal. There were many artists. There were obviously dead artists. There were a group of 7 artists. There were young artists. There were female artists. There were indigenous artists that were there at the museum. And this is where we began. We felt this is an important place to begin. But we also said, in order for the exhibitions for this museum, for this art museum to come alive, it requires visitors. It is you, the visitor, who brings this to life. It is you that brings the ideas, the perspectives, the notions, the thoughts, and you are the one to bring these alive. We also wanted to present the exhibitions and present them in such a way as to provide different approaches. So we began by saying we had to bring various voices. It was said that I was going to speak about the group of 7 today, but I'm not, unfortunately. But here are the group of 7 in this place. I am going to talk briefly and say that these group of 7, some members of the group of 7, did attend the Ontario College of Art and Design University. George Reed was not a group of 7, but he was one of our alumni. Arthur Lismer, J.E.H. MacDonald, many other former alums of the OCAD University were on display in this exhibition. Barbara Assman, Rebecca Belmore, Ian Carr-Harris, Jock McDonald, Micah Snow. Unfortunately, Kent Monkman is not an alumni of OCAD University. Are you, Kent? But he is in there. So we figured we needed to do something about the approaches. We thought, let's do a salon-style hang. We needed to present more women in the space because women were totally underrepresented throughout the galleries. I remember back in the late 80s reading a phrase by the Guerrilla Girls. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Guerrilla Girls, a New York artist group. And they were also concerned about the representation of women in museums. And the famous phrase that they came up with at the time was, "Do women have to be naked to be represented at the Metropolitan Museum of Art?" Well, in this space in the Salon, which is a late 19th century approach to hanging works of art, we have 50% women artists that are represented in this particular area. But it is in the Salon, in the 19th century Salon, that artists who were the most contemporary, the most modern at the time, were refused access to exhibit in these galleries. So they formed another gallery called the Salon des Refus. They were the precursors of what we would refer to as contemporary modernist artists today, and women were certainly very much a part of that push. We tried different styles, different approaches of presenting art and artifact. Here is an indigenous work, a rattle. It's upside down. Why is it upside down? It is of a raven. The Haida people on the west coast of Haida Gwaii would say that the raven is so powerful that you have to be able to control him, so you put him upside down. So this was a style that we brought to the Art Gallery of Ontario. We also added works such as this hide piece that it shows a narrative of warriors in battle amongst the works of Jack Chambers and Alex Colville. We experimented with notions of juxtaposition of other works such as this. This is one of the most famous works in Canada by Tom Thompson called The West Wind, and beside it are two Anishinaabe bags. These bags show a thunderbird and the other underwater panther called the Mishipeshu. So why would we juxtapose these? Why would we interfere with this most famous work by a Canadian artist? Well, we wanted to say that artists see the world from different perspectives. And the work on the right is one that most often we refer to and can see because it is the reality that we see. Here it is, a late afternoon storm about to be brewing. As you can see, there's a tree that you see in northern Ontario. It's very typical of a late afternoon scene. The works on the bags tell of a similar story. They talk about a very ancient archetypal moment in which the battle of good and the bad, the good and the evil is about to happen. The upper world thunderbird representing the good and the Mishipeshu underneath. And they are locked in this eternal battle. And so the indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes would, of course, take refuge on the shores because they realize that they cannot get caught up in the battle that is going on. So we wanted to bring these notions of juxtaposition, these ideas that you could see here. And finally, another approach that we wanted to present is the idea of the contemporary. This, as I said, is the historical Canadian galleries. The galleries that usually begin somewhere in the beginning and run until today. But we wanted to change all that. We wanted to throw in new ideas. So we brought contemporary artists like Kent Monkman to participate in telling of the stories. So as I said earlier, that our understanding of the present is shaped by the lens of the past, and Kent has taken this work and done something very exciting. In fact, if you ever go to the Art Gallery of Ontario on a quiet afternoon, well, nothing is really quiet at the Art Gallery at all, but this, ladies and gentlemen, is probably one of the most popular works because I'm not exactly sure why people are attracted to this. I don't know if Kent even knows the attraction that his work actually brings, but there are many people that sit just and watch and look at this work. Sometimes there are gallery attendants that are talking to the stories. Sometimes they just sit there in quiet gaze looking at this very, very complex work by Kent Monkman. But surely it sits in the Canadian galleries because most often we can look at the contemporary, the modern, the moment right now, but we position this work in the historical galleries because then perhaps we can start looking at history from the lens of the present. So ladies and gentlemen, what we try to do at the Art Gallery is to present new ideas through various approaches, and that you as a citizen and as a gallery goer who brings life to these exhibitions, who bring your perspectives, who will also bring your voices, because you see these exhibitions from various perspectives, whether you're a pilgrim, whether you want to bring, you come alone, you're a craftsman, you're somebody who really enjoys a work of art, you're somebody who wants to bring your grandmother, your children. You come to the museum for different reasons every day. You never come to an art museum the same way. And it is this approach, these ideas, that we wanted to challenge not only ourselves or the curators that I'd worked with, but we wanted to challenge you, the visitor. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to introduce Kent Monkman, who I have worked with. And one of the reasons that I have asked Kent to come and say a few words is that all the artists that I work with, I treat them as intellectuals. That is my training. That is how I see artists, because they do amazing work. They do research. They do reflect on the big issues and the big ideas of our society. They ask new questions. They have new ideas, and they make you see the world very differently, whether it's in very, very straightforward paintings, whether it's in video, whether it's in performance, or whatever. They allow us to understand ourselves, our senses, our identities, and who we are as Canadians. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and I'll invite Ken to come up. That's the large 5 minutes, right? Yeah. Oh, I'm going to have that slide back, please. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Gerald. I just want to speak quickly about my process as an artist, and Gerald asked me to do this because I do a lot of research with my work. And I've been painting for many years, and there was a turning point in my career where I felt that I needed to kind of look back into art history to understand some of the problems that exist in our museums today about how First Nations people have been represented. Often as a contemporary artist, I would find myself being relegated to the Aboriginal gallery, even though I consider myself, a contemporary artist. So I wanted to understand why museum practice was doing this, but also this curiosity led me into art history, and I learned a lot about the 19th century painters who were creating images about First Nations people. And that's really what the crux of my work has been about over the last 15 years, is to examine the work of 19th century painters, North American artists like Paul Kane, Canadian, George Catlin, Albert Bierstadt, a number of painters whose chosen subject were the first people of North America. So I've done a lot of research, gone to museums all across North America, looking at their paintings and also reading their journals to understand their work, to understand the subjectivity in their work, and to understand why, for instance, they chose to represent First Nations people in the way that they did. So there were a number of themes that emerged in that process of learning about their work. And of course, one of the main themes was that artists of that period, and in general people of that period, really believed that First Nations people were a vanishing race. So artists like George Catlin and Paul Kane really emphasized this idea in their work, in that they wanted to encapsulate Native people in kind of frozen in time in this period of the 19th century. They considered First Nations people who had, who wore European clothing or showed cultural influence of the European settlers, that it was a form of contamination. So when I understood more about the artists and some of the intent of their work, it helped me to understand a lot better why museums were also kind of perpetuating these ideas in the way that they were not only displaying work from the 19th century as a kind of a voice of authority on First Nations people, but also how they were perpetuating ideas that originated in the work of that period. For instance, there's the work of George Catlin, a very famous painting that I've, reacted to a number of times. It was a painting, a scene called Dance to the Bear Dash, and it was an honor dance performed in the Sac and Fox tribes of the third gender, the male who lived as the female in that community. And, he made the painting, he showed that scene, but in his journal he talked about how it was one of the most disgusting things he'd ever seen and how he wished for it to be extinguished forever. So George Catlin for me really became this person, this man of contradiction that I've, taken to task on a number of different ways about how First Nations people were represented. And I think with this project at the Art Gallery of Ontario, this is really something that I've done. This is kind of a good example of the work that I do with a number of museums, both in the United States and Canada, as I get the opportunity to go into a museum and look through their collections, sometimes quite randomly, sometimes with a very strong focus, to work with curators, to find objects, to find two-dimensional images, to find anything that will help me to kind of unpack some of these problems from the art of that period. And so this process that Gerald led me through at the AGO was a fascinating journey for me because I discovered many things about art from that period, Aboriginal artifacts and European paintings and Canadian paintings, and I found themes that related across the different cultures, things that were different, things that were similar. And so this is really a kind of at the core of my work is finding similarities and differences from the different cultures and stitching them together in these paintings, which are often quite complex. So I think that pretty much covers it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gerald and Kent. We're going to switch topics and dip into the digital world now. Michael, I want you to come up and tell us how the digital world has really changed copyright laws. So much has happened.
Great, well thank you. And thanks so much to the organizers for the invitation. It's an honor to be part of such a great panel focusing on important and diverse issues. So as you heard, I hold the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law, which means that I get to focus on a lot of different things, whether it's privacy or telecom, but it's copyright that I have to say is really my first love and the one that I'm really excited to have the chance to talk a bit about. I think the reason is that copyright affects all of us in a myriad of different ways, whether we think about it from an educational perspective and a research perspective, whether it's about us as consumers and some of the rights that we have, whether it's about commerce and new innovations that we're looking to see take place and how copyright can enable and at times restrict some of those activities, and of course the creative process as well and what it means to both protect creators and allow creators to build upon the past in a way that they've got the kind of flexibilities they need. Now, given the kind of importance that copyright has had, as you heard at the outset, we have in Canada faced an enormous amount of pressure in terms of what our laws could or should look like. We're not alone in that regard. Lots of countries face that kind of pressure. But given where we are situated geographically, living, of course, right beside the United States, the largest exporter of a lot of copyrighted works, we have faced perhaps more pressure than any other country when it comes to what our copyright laws could or should look like. But we also face pressure certainly from Europe with the trade agreement with the European Union and major lobby groups as well. And so given that pressure, it may come as a bit of a surprise to hear that I think it's fair to say that Canada has emerged in the last couple of years as one of the most friendly when it comes to user rights anywhere in the world. What I want to do is talk a little bit about how that happened. And as I mentioned, as you may have seen at the first slide, it all culminated in 2 weeks. 2 weeks back in 2012, where over this period, you can see there, June 29th to July the 12th, 2 major events take place over that period of time. On the 29th of June 2012, the government wraps up what had been about a decade or even more worth of debates, very contentious debates, over copyright reform with a bill known as Bill C-11, and it receives royal assent. And then just a couple of weeks later, the Supreme Court of Canada gives copyright geeks like me sort of Christmas, Hanukkah, and just about every holiday you can imagine, all combined into a single day where they release 5 copyright decisions in a single day. Comes to be known as the copyright pentology. And so those 2 events really put us on this trajectory to become one of the most user rights friendly countries in the world when it comes to copyright. Now, what's the backstory? How did this come about? All of this plays out over a period of about a decade or so. And my starting point for that is this hearing here. It was a hearing that was conducted by the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage back in 2004. It was chaired by then a Toronto area MP by the name of Sarmeet Sam Bultay, who was also the Parliamentary Secretary for Canadian Heritage. This committee holds a half day on each of the major contentious issues, a half day for education, a half day for the role of internet service providers, a half day for international treaties, and adopts what is a unquestionably strong, very inflexible approach. It's one where the lobby groups play a very significant role, and one that certainly U.S. government, which was pressuring us, would have been very happy with the outcome. The goal was to try to encourage the government to move forward with legislation. And sure enough, a number of months later, we get the first attempt at those reforms, a bill known as Bill C-60. Now, that bill is introduced by a Liberal government, and it's a bill in which we find there is practically nothing from a user perspective. There's nothing in the way of reform to fair dealing, which would be Canada's version of fair use, no consumer exceptions, no internet-related exceptions, nothing to deal with statutory damages that, as we've seen sometimes in the news, can leave individuals facing hundreds of thousands or even millions in liability. We do find new restrictions in the way of what are known as digital locks that can be used to lock down digital products like DVDs or electronic books. And we do find some protections for telecom companies or internet service providers who've always been a pretty powerful voice in all of this. Now, this bill doesn't go anywhere. The Liberal government falls, and we get an election campaign. This was the campaign, you may recall, that straddled the December holidays. It started in early December, wrapped up in January. And Sam Bultay, here in the Toronto area, in the Toronto riding of Parkdale High Park, has a fundraiser that's being held for her 4 days before the election. It's being sponsored, and you can barely make it up at the top there, by Doug Frith, who headed the Motion Picture Association at the time, Graham Henderson, who was head of the Music Industry Association, the heads of the Software Association and the Publisher Association. So the major lobby groups had come together to put on this fundraiser 4 days before the campaign. Now, whatever you think about copyright, the notion of bringing in the major lobby groups funding one of the lead decision makers on this issue really, I think, raises some ethical questions about the willingness to take that kind of funding. And so I blogged about it under this blog here. That's what Friends are for. And a lot of other people did as well. In fact, the issue became, as Maclean's described it, as Bultay versus the bloggers, as people within that riding began to really take notice of copyright and some of the concerns that were emerging. In fact, at the very first all-candidates meeting, Bultay was there in a stage, I guess, somewhat similar to this, in your proverbial church basement, a number of blocks, I suppose, from here. And all the candidates were asked if they'd be willing to take the copyright pledge, where they would agree not to take any money from copyright stakeholders, whatever the perspective, so long as they were in one of these decision-making processes. Some of the candidates, including a new NDP candidate by the name of Peggy Nash, said yes, she would take the pledge. Sam Bultay said that she wasn't going to let Michael Geist and the Electronic Frontier Foundation and those pro-user zealots try to intimidate her and silence her, which I took to be a no. The election takes place several weeks later, and in an area here in Toronto, in the GTA, where only 2 ridings changed hands. One was Olivia Chow's riding, and the other was this riding here in Parkdale High Park, where thousands of votes switched from Bultay ultimately to Peggy Nash, who many of you may know. as that riding changed, and copyright played a role in that change. Now, in the months that followed, we began to see various groups, musicians who were unhappy with the industry perspectives, begin to emerge and speak out, whether it was musicians or artists, the privacy community, and also the academic community. This was the first of 3 books that I led together with many other researchers from across the province and across the country, as we published under open access licenses, so all these books are free to download, talking about a different vision for copyright. Now, we get a change of government, and by 2007, it's now the Conservative government, and Jim Prentice is the MP, and he's about to introduce legislation in December of 2007. Only a funny thing happens on the way to that legislation being introduced. It wasn't. I started a Facebook group called Fair Copyright for Canada about a week before the legislation was to have been introduced, and while I recognize that by today's standards that sounds pretty unremarkable, at the time the use of social media for advocacy purposes was really in its infancy. And so first 500 and then 1,000 and then 10,000 people joined the group. Ultimately 90,000 people join, and there are Facebook groups that pop up in communities across the country. We blog about it. There are meetings where the minister is actually having a holiday party, and people will drive some instances hours just for a couple of minutes with the minister, now of course the Premier of Alberta, just to talk about a piece of legislation that hadn't even been introduced yet. Now, the government actually blinks. It doesn't introduce the legislation at that time, but it comes back 6 months later. Now, I wish I could tell you that the government saw the error of their ways and came up with something that had a lot of the user interests at heart, but it didn't. Practically nothing changed, but by then the public had become engaged. So much so that Industry Canada receives 30,000 physical letters within weeks of this legislation having been introduced. Those Facebook groups begin to meet in real space in communities like Vancouver or here in Montreal, where they set up a wiki to talk about what they could do and become more engaged on these issues. We used things like Google Maps to cover media coverage and talk about whether it was positive or negative. In this case, red was negative, yellow was neutral, and blue was positive. So the media coverage was generally very negative. Used Google Calendar to talk about local meetings, and even had t-shirts and mugs, which my wife would like me to throw out by now, all around Fair Copyright for Canada, and ran a YouTube contest, C61 in 61 seconds, where we had artists and the Ontario Privacy Commissioner at the time serve as judges. All of this has such an impact that MPs from across the country say that copyright is one of the top issues that they hear about all summer long, with some even holding town hall meetings on the issue. When the government comes back, rather than reintroducing this legislation, it holds copyright consultations. And once again, the public shows up at a time when many instances the public doesn't become actively engaged when the government asks for opinions. More than 8,000 people participated in this public consultation. So that by the time the government introduces legislation in 2010, passing it, though, 2 years later in 2012, the academic community has talked about it. Here's the next book that we do talking about this legislation itself, and things have changed. We get new purposes for fair dealing expanded to include things like education, parody, and satire. We get new exceptions for things like making backup copies. We get new internet exceptions, such as the first in the world, an exception for making non-commercial user-generated content, so that people who make new kinds of creations using remix and mashup know that that kind of work will be lawful. And we create new standards for liability so that those who may infringe but for non-commercial purposes don't face the prospect of losing their life savings. Now, at the same time that that's taking place quite quickly, the courts are shifting as well. If we go back to 1990, which was when the court had previously talked about copyright, we find that it talks about copyright in the context of having a single purpose, passed solely for the benefit of authors of all kinds, whether their works were literary, dramatic, or musical. The kind of work that we've seen and people speaking out on these issues begin to presage a shift at the court as well. So that by 2012, in a case involving a Quebec artist known as Claude Desberges, we get the court talking about the danger not only of under-protecting, but also the dangers that exist with overprotecting, as those restrictions may unduly inhibit the ability for people to use works, to build upon the knowledge of others. 2 years later, in 2004, in a case that actually also was local, the Great Library in Toronto, just a few blocks away, the court talks about the issue of copyright exceptions, things like fair dealing, being user rights, and the need to strike a balance between, on the one hand, creator rights and user rights on the other. All of which leads us to this copyright pentology. Here's another book that we ended up doing on this, also available through open access, that examines the various decisions. And we get the court doing everything from talking about the need for technological neutrality when it comes for copyright, in a case that involved software games and the prospect of whether or not games that are downloaded that includes music on those games ought to pay an additional fee merely for the fact that they're downloaded rather than purchased from a local store. Or another case in which the court talks about what the notion of research means and adopts the most broad definition possible, talking that it can include anything even for personal interest, in a case that examined whether or not song previews could be considered consumer research for the purposes of fair dealing as people think about whether or not they want to purchase one of those songs. And then critically, from an education perspective, the court in the access copyright case, once and for all says that students and teachers have a symbiotic purpose, and that copies that teachers engage in on behalf of students ought to enjoy the same kinds of flexibilities and user rights that students would have if they make those copies on their own. This is the most pro-user rights court in the world. And so bringing together what the government has done along with the courts leaves us in this situation as a country with one of the most user-friendly systems anywhere. And what I think makes this notable, and with this I'll conclude, is not just that we've managed to do that right beside the US giant lobbying all the way, but that the Canadian way has been one that has combined things like research and open access to that research, new forms of advocacy in social media, and new attempts, new ways to try to disseminate that knowledge so that the public isn't just a recipient of that, but becomes an active participant in trying to shape what some of these sorts of policies that affect all of our daily lives ultimately look like. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. Now the response. Brent, Laurentian University librarian, want to know how your life has been impacted, your daily life, your work life, by Michael's work.
I come at copyright from two different angles, actually. I knew very little about copyright a few years ago. But back in about 2008, I became the executive director for the Canadian Association of Research Libraries, CARL, many of you may know. And in that period, 2008 leading up to, as Michael said, 2012, there was a lot of ferment on the copyright scene. And a lot of this was of considerable concern to Canada's university libraries. So I had to learn a lot about copyright very quickly. One of the first pieces of advice I got when I took that job was that the best thing I could do would be to subscribe to Michael's blog, which I soon learned came out almost every day, every couple of days anyway. And I think in the 6 years I was with CARL, I read most of them, even when they suddenly appeared early on a Saturday or Sunday morning, which amazed me or horrified me. As Michael said, there have been huge changes in the copyright scene in Canada, and this has affected our universities in pretty important ways. So my second exposure to issues of copyright comes from my present job, which is as library director at Laurentian University. My official title is University Librarian, but everybody just assumes, well, of course I'm a librarian at a university. But no, it's as the library director. So I end up having to talk with others on my campus about copyright. And like many universities, we're considering whether to step outside of our relationship with our national English language copyright collective, Access Copyright, I don't know what our answer will be, but it's something that we have to talk about on our campus and on many campuses. And so again, I was preparing some briefing notes for my VP recently and went onto the internet, as good librarians do. And one of the first things I came across was one of Michael's blogs from last fall, talking about the newest blanket license offerings from Access Copyright. And of course, I found it informative and helpful. So the scene has changed dramatically in the last decade, and even the last 5 years. We've moved, and I'll just talk about the university setting. We've moved from a period when all the universities were paying huge fees to our copyright collectives, Access Copyright and Copybec in Quebec, for a blanket license that allowed us to do certain things that we assumed were above and beyond what we could probably do outside of such an arrangement. And at a certain point, in 2004, the Supreme Court told us that we had certain user rights and that fair dealing was one that we could make more use of likely, and it probably had much greater application than we were giving it, which caused people, especially in the libraries, because we're paying license fees all the time, and we're also having to advise others on campus, faculty as teachers or students as users of copyrighted materials, what they can and can't do. So we're concerned about these things. This went on. In 2009 or 2008, Access Copyright decided to propose to the Copyright Board a tariff that would see a vast increase in the price that universities would be paying for a blanket arrangement with university or with the copyright collectives. And this caused people in universities, and speaking as a librarian, certainly in the libraries across the country, to think, well, maybe, surely there's another way that we could be working. It looks like we're being asked to pay a lot more for something that we think is actually becoming less valuable as we move more to direct licenses with digital vendors, publishers. And we're spending more and more of our money in such arrangements, direct licenses with our vendors. And as well, the world of open access has been developing. Perhaps there are certainly more that can be, we can benefit more from open access as well, and various other considerations. So I know that many of my counterparts would be talking to their university administrations about this and saying maybe we can find another way to work. At the same time, of course, the courts were working through a case, I think that Michael mentioned, where the ministers of education across the country were looking at a dispute with Access Copyright on what should be allowable as fair dealing in the schools. That would become important in 2012 as one of the Pentology decisions. And then finally, again, as Michael outlined, the copyright reform series of bills between 2006 and 2011. The scene has changed dramatically after the events that Michael outlined. Now, instead of all of the universities paying rather onerous fees to Access Copyright or Copybec, There's really two systems, two approaches that have emerged. One, yes, universities are still choosing to have that arrangement with Access Copyright, to use the English language world. But they're also developing their own arrangements. Some have decided to go outside of that relationship and develop ways to manage copyright in-house, so to speak, by making full use of their user rights, full use of the exceptions in the Copyright Act, especially fair dealing. And that's not free. It still costs money. Often they hire a copyright advisor or copyright officer to work with the community to educate users so that they stay within the requirements of copyright, but also how to make use of the rights that users do have under the Act. But a lot of money has been saved across the country collectively by both that approach and, I think, as we go forward, even those universities that will choose to continue to have a relationship with, a licensed relationship with our copyright collectives will also save money because the new licenses are much less expensive, much more appropriately priced probably. So this has been a huge impact for all of our universities and will be a huge impact. It's also saved money in many cases for students because often it's student ancillary fees that have gone to support copyright license payments for some universities. So major changes. I want to leave that at that point, but I want to go back to Michael Geist himself. He's been a huge influence on this entire process. Not just him, but heavily Michael. He's been forefront in many ways. His research, his academic research, is probably most appreciated by others in faculties of law across the country, and I'm sure that's all very good. But that research informs his popular writing through his blog, through his newspaper columns, that have influenced advocates and lobbyists, such as myself when I was with Carl, that have influenced deciders, because I know that there have been many members of parliament, judges, who else? I had a whole list in mind, but people who decide policies who aren't experts in copyright, in the details of copyright technology and law, but who came to understand issues through Michael's columns and blogs. And also the end users, such as myself in my own position, who need to work in my institution with my administration and with my colleagues to decide what we need to do around local copyright policy. His columns have been immensely important for helping Canadians who have a vague idea that these issues around copyright, especially as they use the web, as they use the internet, they have a vague idea that there are important issues there, but they don't always understand them. And Michael, without dumbing down the issues, and you might need to read a dozen of the columns on a given topic, fair dealing, whatever, digital locks, to finally get a whole picture, but he's educated thousands of Canadians that would never have understood these issues, would never have had the language to write to their MPs, to talk to have informed discussions on their campuses. And so this trickle-down effect of the research that Michael has done and the writing and explaining has been crucial. And I think that we can't underestimate the importance of researchers who, yes, do their research and yes, do publish academically, but also inform the rest of us. And in this case on copyright, which has been so important for our universities and other settings, of course. Thank you.
Brant, thank you so much. I've got your pen. Let's put the spotlight on Citizen Lab right now and ask Ron Dibert to come and tell us a bit about what you're working on and what it entails. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. How are you doing? Everybody doing well? So I'm the director of the Citizen Lab, which is based at the Munk School of Global Affairs. Professor Toop is the new director. We've been there since 2001. We're an interdisciplinary research laboratory focusing on the area of digital media, human rights, and global security. We apply a mixed methods approach to the topic. So by that I mean we combine the skills and methods of computer science, engineering, social science, law, and field research to uncover how information controls operate, often in ways that are not apparent to the average user, and focusing on questions that are important for human rights. We're not an activist group or an advocacy group. Instead, we try to zero in on issues that will be important for civil society, such as documenting patterns of internet censorship worldwide, looking at internet surveillance, and computer network attacks of various sorts. We've been called kind of a CSI of cyberspace, and I think that's kind of appropriate. I think most people know us for a 2009 report called the Tracking GhostNet Report, and it was a very big report for us. It was covered widely in the world media when it came out. It was the first public documentation of a China-based cyber espionage report. Now that's much more common. Back then it was very rare. It was on the front page of the New York Times and the Globe and Mail and just about every world media outlet on that day. And one of the reasons it was covered so extensively in the world media was because of the scope and scale and significance of the victims of this cyber espionage campaign. So the GhostNet attackers that were based in China were able to compromise the computers, thousands of computers in hundreds of countries of some very high-profile targets. And there's a sample list, so the United Nations, ministries of foreign affairs, embassies, diplomatic missions, United Nations, ASEAN, Associated Press, on and on and on. So it was truly quite remarkable in terms of what we had uncovered. We spent many months analyzing the data and effectively had a bird's eye view, if you will, behind the back view of what the attackers were seeing, how they were able to do this, who they were targeting, what they were exfiltrating or taking from the computers under their control. Now, we didn't set out to discover a cyber espionage network. The way it all started for us was actually working with Tibetan communities. So just before we published that report, about a year before, we became aware that Tibetan communities, especially in Dharamsala, where His Holiness the Dalai Lama is located and the Tibetan government in exile are located, but Tibetans really all over the world were concerned. They had feelings that maybe their computers were being spied on by the Chinese government, but they had no evidence for that. So they took really what was a great risk. They heard about us, they came to us and they said, will you take a look at this? And in doing so, they really entrusted to us access, unrestricted access to their computers in several locations. So our researchers went to northern India, we went to offices in New York and London, here in Toronto, and we effectively wiretapped their machines with their consent, We also looked very closely at emails they received, and through that we found out, yes indeed, the Tibetans, the office of the Dalai Lama itself is thoroughly compromised by China-based attackers. They can see everything that is being communicated and all the documents on their computers. Now, we also found out through that how the attackers were able to do this. And that's because the attackers were sloppy. They made a mistake. They forgot to password protect a web-based interface that was a meticulous documentation of all of the victims. And so through that, we were able to see essentially what they were doing. Now you may ask, how does an attacker like this get inside someone's computer? Well, the way it works in this case and in most cases we find is through social engineered emails that have attachments that contain malicious software. This is an example of one of the emails. It's kind of ground zero of the report that was received by the office of the Dalai Lama. And it is an email that contains an attachment with malware. Now, if you look at this email, you'll notice right away, this is not your typical spam. It's not an advertisement for Viagra, or it's not something coming from a Nigerian prince looking to offload millions of dollars. It looks legitimate. It's coming from what looks to be a credible organization. You can see at the top, campaigns, Tibet, and so on, and it's asking for support for a Tibetan cause. Here's another one more recently that's even more legitimate looking. This is a spoofed email that appears to come from someone who actually works for the Dalai Lama. That's a real person, except he never sent that email. It's a spoofed email, and it says here, please find attached a document that contains the Dalai Lama's schedule for trips throughout Europe, and it's a Word document. Who wouldn't click on that, especially if you're a Tibetan organization who's about to receive the Dalai Lama? It's irresistible for organizations not to open attachments like this, and that's of course the weak spot the attackers use to get inside a victim's computer or device. They exploit some vulnerability, usually in Microsoft or the operating system. And what they do once they're inside the machine is they usually implant a very sophisticated virus or malware that provides them with a high degree of capability. This is the one that the GhostNet attackers used. It's called GhostRat. And you're looking here at the drop-down menu, essentially a list of the capabilities that the attackers had at their disposal. So if you look at the drop-down menu, I don't know if you can read that, you can see the attackers can take a screenshot of the desktop. They can record every keystroke that's entered into the keyboard, including, of course, being able to see what passwords are entered. Most importantly, they can turn on the audio and the video, effectively turning anyone's device into a silent wiretap or a listening device. So these are very powerful capabilities that were at the hands of the attackers. Think of those capabilities and then think back to the victims that I outlined. Prime Minister's offices, ministries of foreign affairs, the United Nations, embassies, and so on. It is really remarkable what was at their disposal. Now this software, GhostRat, which is how we gave the name to the network, GhostNet, is actually open source. Michael, you'll appreciate that. Freely available. Its interface has been translated into multiple languages, so you can go home tonight if you want, download it, and start playing with it, maybe with each other. I wouldn't recommend that. Now, since 2009, of course, we've been doing a lot of research in this area, and frankly, what we've seen has been highly disturbing. I'll give you a couple of examples here. On the left side here is a news report about a Citizen Lab study that we did that involved one individual who is an activist, a pro-democracy activist in the United Arab Emirates. He was detained by security services, tortured, interrogated. During the course of his interrogations, he was presented with transcripts of his Skype communications. And he thought, what the heck, Skype? I thought that was encrypted. I was told it's a secure means to communicate what's going on. So when he got out of detention, He contacted a reporter and asked if the reporter could get in touch with Citizen Lab researchers. So with his consent, our researchers spent a lot of hours looking through his mobile and his laptop. And what they discovered was that the UAE government had purchased highly sophisticated commercial spyware sold by a British company, Gamma Group, products called FinFisher, that allowed them to effectively spy on his computer without his knowledge, and they gave that information to the UAE authorities who apprehended him. On the right, another case very similar. These are journalists, Ethiopian expat journalists who run a satellite broadcasting company based in Virginia in the United States. Like the pro-democracy activists, they suspected something was going on with their computers. They reached out to us with their consent. We examined them. We found out that in this case, the Ethiopian government had purchased a highly sophisticated Italian spyware manufactured by a company called Hacking Team that allowed them to get inside the computers of these journalists. Actually, that's against the law in the United States. And so these journalists are now represented by Electronic Frontier Foundation suing the government of Ethiopia in U.S. court. This is one of my favorite research reports that we did flowing from this type of research. So if you think about it, if you are the Ethiopian government, you purchase this type of software, highly sophisticated military-grade spyware, and you're using it to spy on human rights activists, you're essentially taking data from victims' computers. It has to go somewhere that you have access to. And that's obviously obfuscated by the company that sells the software. They go to great lengths to hide the transmission of that data. Well, our researchers spent many, many hours reverse engineering samples of the spyware, and were able to isolate essentially the handshake of the communications traffic. And then they took high-powered computers and scanned the entire internet to find the actual command and control servers of those samples of commercial spyware, and it enabled us to determine which countries were purchasing this spyware. And as you can see, it's a pretty sad picture because you have among the world's most authoritarian regimes, dictatorships like Uzbekistan and so on, using spyware sold by British and Italian European companies. After this report came out, and based on our research and others who are researching this area, international agreements were modified. Now the Wassenaar Arrangement, which is an international agreement to control the export of dual-use military-grade technologies, has been modified to include this type of spyware, something I'm very proud of. Canada is a signatory to that international agreement, and we will have to modify our own domestic laws to be in compliance with this international arrangement. We've also looked at cases around the use of this type of spyware in conflict zones, especially Syria. As you may know from the Arab Spring, and in the case of Syria, opposition groups there are very digitally empowered. They use these technologies to organize, but that can be their Achilles heel. So like in other countries, we found that the Syrian regime, other regimes in the region use this type of technology to go actually apprehend and murder opposition groups, journalists, and so on. So it's a very serious game. Last fall, we released a culminating report called the Communities at Risk Report. I wanted to spotlight it because it's one of the things I'm very proud about that our team has done recently. This was a formal study involving the participation of 10 NGOs who signed up over a 4-year period. They were given confidentiality, very much like a clinical study. As you can see, the groups range in size and region and so on. Some very large human rights organizations that everyone in the room would probably know by name. Over the course of 4 years, they shared with us samples of emails that looked suspicious to them. Some of them had their network traffic opened up to our researchers, and we put in place devices that allowed us to see what type of traffic was entering and exiting their systems. And through that, we got a good picture of the type of attacks that are facing civil society globally. And it's a very disturbing picture. Civil society organizations are being persistently attacked with highly sophisticated, targeted digital attacks undertaken by their adversaries, governments that are autocratic and repressive, and they have no capacity to deal with it. These are the same sort of attacks that you hear about all the time in the media, hitting governments, Fortune 500 companies. The big difference here, of course, is that these groups have no capacity to deal with the problem, and instead of theft of intellectual property, blueprint for some kind of new device, we're talking about possibly the loss of a human life, murder, in other words. So it's a very serious game. I want to end here by pointing out, I said at the beginning, Citizen Lab is not an activist or advocacy group, but as you can see, I hope from my presentation, we do work with a lot of groups who do advocacy, and there are many public litigation cases ongoing because of our research, and also many activist campaigns. One that is very special to me, because we've worked so closely with them for so long, is the advocacy of Tibetan groups like Students for Free Tibet. And here they have this great campaign called Detach from Attachments, which sort of is a play on their philosophy, but also a very serious precautionary warning for users to be very careful when opening attachments. I'll end by saying that when you step back and you look, just in a short period of time, we've really turned our digital lives inside out. And we now, I'm sure everyone in the room carries around with them a mobile device in their pocket. We are surrounded by digital technology. It seems to be in our face all the time. But much of what goes on in and through this technology is not transparent to the user. And there is a vast physical infrastructure, a subterranean world that supports it all, of fiber optic cables, servers, computers, routers, internet service providers, internet exchange points like the one on this street here, which by the way is very close to CSIS headquarters here in Toronto for a very good reason. Thanks to the disclosures of Edward Snowden, we now know that this vast subterranean world of cyberspace is the place where power is exercised. And if we are going to protect human rights and privacy, like access to information, freedom of speech, we need to have independent, impartial research that lifts the lid on all this and shows what goes on beneath the surface that's not apparent to the average user. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ron. Ron mentioned Students for Free Tibet, and we're going to ask Ugin now to come in. I have to tell you, Ugin asked me earlier if dancing was allowed, and I said, there are no rules. Yes, it is. So this should be fun. Ugin.
Do I just press the button, or? Okay, I thought I had a slideshow, but I guess that's fine. Okay, like Ron has talked about, the Tibetan movement is one that consistently faces attacks from the Chinese government. You know, it's very concerning because a lot of our organizations, groups, community associations, we're not big on budget, you know. We're actually a quite small population. Inside Tibet, there's maybe 7 to 8 million Tibetans. And Tibet is a huge geography. If you have looked ever at the geography of Tibet, it is a plateau region. It's called the roof of the world in expression. And communication between large spaces is crucial. It has been crucial for advocacy for Tibet. Our people were nomadic people. So just imagine, like, each community maybe had 5 families stretched across hundreds of kilometers. When mobile technology came about, social media came about, it instantly connected many of us in ways that we couldn't imagine. Suddenly, people started to advocate and be heard throughout the plateau in ways that were unimaginable before. And outside Tibet, you know, we do a pretty good job of keeping up the advocacy. I mean, in some ways, when we found out from the report that the Tibetan groups were one of the most highly targeted groups, It is concerning in a way, but it's also something that we take pride in. Like, wow, they're really spending a lot of time to bring us down. In our culture, there's a saying, "Tab chunjung metabo," which means a small oven but a lot of heat. That's exactly what the Tibetan government is like. The Tibetan movement is like. So for me, the email examples that Ron showed are very typical. It's something I face on a daily basis. But before I talk about that, I want to kind of bring the reality to the ground. My grandfather was imprisoned inside Tibet for supporting the resistance. He died very young. He was tortured in prison. My father, after him, was shot when he was protesting in 1989 in Lhasa, which is not more than 30 years ago. So this is a really a real situation. It is not something that's made up of idealistic notions of what freedom looks like. These are reports from just this year, since January, people who are arrested for having pictures of the Dalai Lama or advocating for freedom or writing on blog posts about how they would want to change the government or how the occupation is wrong. So these are just from this year alone, and it hasn't been long into this year. The kinds of emails I receive on a daily basis, some claim to be the Prime Minister of Tibet. Some claim to be part of an email string. We have this listserv called Tibet Support Groups, and they would copy exactly what a report looks like and then insert the links. Obviously, because I'm empowered by the work of Citizen Lab and others, I wouldn't click on these, but I can totally imagine my dad clicking on any of these links without a second hesitation. And what they do is really scary. Like Ron said, they can turn on your cameras, they could record your keystrokes. This is a reality that I face on a daily basis. If I don't get emails from the Chinese, these kind of emails that look to compromise the computers every month, I think something's wrong. Like, am I not doing enough work for Tibet today? So that's the reality that we live in. The reason why Citizen Lab's work is so important is because it legitimizes the threat that we face from the Chinese government and through other means. When COASTnet came out, it was huge. We were like, wow, like the Tibetan movement is being affected. Tibetan groups are targeted. When Asia Chats came out, they exposed the kind of apps on mobile phones that were directly connected to the Chinese government. These things are immensely important to us because they teach us what could go wrong. I don't think that's me, but that teaches what could go wrong when you download attachments from organizations that you don't know about. And it's not just us. It's not, if I get this email and I open it, maybe I'm not going to be threatened that much, but the people that I'm connected to and the people that they are connected to. The examples I showed you of people being arrested, they're being arrested for sharing information outside of Tibet. I could know 100 people who could know 100 people who could somehow be connected, right? So it's not just who we know that are being compromised, but the people who know people we know, the far connections. So how do we turn this work into empowerment? Well, Citizen Lab has been great enough to translate a lot of their work into Tibetan. Their reports have been translated and shared across Tibetan communities, Dharamsala, the exile headquarters of the Tibetan government, all over the world. I personally held a lot of workshops where I've taught people and brought them together and explained them, detached from attachments. I know, it's a Buddhist saying, so let's try to simplify what it means to protect yourself on the internet. This kind of work is really important because, like I said, we're a small oven that produces a lot of heat. But we can't do this without support from individuals and organizations who empower us, who really work with integrity. We live in a time where the Chinese government has a lot of power. They have a lot of sway. And they're getting into our schools through Confucius Institutes. They're really influencing a lot of world policy, but work like Citizen Lab stands with the Tibetan people. And that really means a lot to people like us. We don't have all that money. So Tibet Action Institute is a project of our organization, Students for Free Tibet, and they've actually produced an animation that aims to raise awareness and educate the common people about the effects of online security. I don't know how to press play on this, but maybe go next. Are you able to play the video? Okay. So, yeah, I want to end with this video. I hope you'll enjoy it. Thank you, Citizen Lab, and thank you, Ontario Research, for empowering small groups of people and fighting the good fight. Thank you.
My name is Tenzin. I live in Dharamsala in India, but my home is in Tibet. That's where most of my family is still. It's hard not being with them, but it's a little easier now that we have internet and mobile phones. Thank God for technology. It lets me keep tabs on the people I love, no matter how far away we are. I would say I live a good part of my life online because that's how I can stay connected to them. Unfortunately, we're not the only ones using this technology to keep tabs on people. Recently, I learned something awful. In the past few years, thousands of Tibetans' computers and now also phones have been secretly infected by viruses and turned into spy tools that allow the Chinese government unrestricted access to our lives, even here in exile. I had to wonder, were mine infected? I learned about viruses that could let the Chinese government turn on my webcam and watch me through it. Listen to me through the microphone on my computer, record every keystroke I type, read every message I send and receive. They can even intercept and poison email attachments I send out, so that people who trust me are tricked into letting viruses into their computers. Even governments and big companies aren't able to defend themselves. At first, knowing all this made me paranoid and depressed. It seemed too hard to deal with. These attacks are so sophisticated, and I'm not a tech person. I thought the only solution was to hire big-time cybersecurity superheroes, or to pay a lot of money for expensive antivirus software. But then I realized that the solution was much closer than I thought. Turns out, I am the best antivirus. Digital security is all about me and my good habits online. Think before you click. Keep your software up to date. Know your app. Don't give the bad guys permission to enter your life. Remember, the best antivirus is me and you. Learn the ways of the cybersecurity superhero here and stay safer for Tibet.
At this point, I want to lead the gentlemen in a discussion. We'll go for about 10 minutes. There are a couple of common themes, a couple of words I've been jotting down as some notes as the gentlemen spoke. And then we'll open up the floor and ask you if you have any questions. Hopefully, we were talking about people weighing in on social media, on Twitter. Hopefully we can gather a question or two from that realm as well. But right now, I'm going to sit back down and we'll have a discussion, and hopefully you'll join in that discussion in about 10 minutes' time. So there were a couple of words that I noticed that all of you used. And the first one was change. All of you said the word change at one point or another in your talk to everyone here this evening. And so I wanted to know, and I'm going to start with you, Gerald, because this is where we started this evening. What precipitated the biggest change in the realm that you work with, or work in? You talked about having to rehang a gallery. You talked about indigenizing institutions in this country. What was the biggest precipitator of change with regards to your work?
Well, thank you for the question. I think it's work that I've been doing all of my life. From a very young person, just right out of high school, and meeting mentors along the way. I think it's looking from people at the past who encouraged me all along, but for some reason, I've been focused so much on these ideas for so long about how do we change, because I grew up in the 70s, and what I was hearing today as well, each of us has a particular interest that where we want to shift the way that things have been done for so long. And I thought I'd live in this country, and this country, I keep hearing everywhere, oh, we're celebrating 125th anniversary or 100 and something of our country, and then I look around and I go, folks like Kent and I, you know, our ancestors have been here for so long. So what is it that is wrong with the picture? We're proud to live in this country, of course, there's no doubt about that, but our institutions have also been very much slow to respond to the changes. And what I see, I think, might be the single most effect upon me is I think the conglomeration of people thinking like this. And it's not just me or someone, but you get inspired by others. And I think along the way, you find out, you start building upon that and realize that there is a critical mass soon of people that really are thinking like you, but may not necessarily be your neighbor or someone, but somebody far away. And I think that for me was the moment when I started meeting others with a like mind, and just even prior to the internet, you know, you realize you have to go to school somewhere, and I went to school in the US and realized there are people thinking like me. I was isolated in Saskatchewan, you know, I needed to go physically. Now I don't have to, you know. And I think that was the nice thing prior to that is how do you connect and interconnect with other people, like-minded people, and I think that being in a digital world today, I think is so critical to that. But in the old days, as we say, you know, that was the thing, and I needed to click on those people, and I think that's what got me going. And I was really inspired, and I think that the shift, the changes that you inspire in others has been very prominent in my life.
Thank you so much. You mentioned mentors and mentees, and Kent, I want to throw this out to you because we can learn so very much and glean so very much from those who came before us. And you mentioned Gerald's impact on your life. But how has that impact, the impact of Gerald and others, changed the way you work?
Well, I think, is this on? Can you hear me?
If not, I'm going to give you mine.
It's on.
Is it on?
Is it on? It's on. You can hear me? I think the impact of Gerald and others has been that they open doors. They open doors, and it's been a long process of opening doors in these institutions that have basically been like gatekeepers. They've been protecting the dominant narrative, and people like Gerald and others, we've been challenging that dominant narrative that exists in art history, that exists in the history that we all learned in school, that it was one-sided, that it told one side of the story. In all of those paintings that I've studied and looked at, I mean, we were painted out of those pictures, you know, and in many of those landscapes, people didn't even exist. So I think, you know, Gerald and many other people, you know, from our communities have, you know, done a lot of hard work to get inside the institutions, to become curators, to become museum directors, which, you know, breaks down and indigenizes those places where, you know, a First Nations perspective has been missing. And a lot of my work goes into examining, you know, objects that, and paintings and images that represent that point of view and challenging it, finding problems with it, poking holes in it, and finding all of the missing narratives that you know, have never really been brought forward.
Yeah. Excellent response. And Michael, I want to go to you now because you talked about copyright law, but the change that social media brought about really impacted your work. So a word or two about that.
Well, it did, and I have to say, it took me by surprise too. You know, I briefly told the story of the Facebook group that I started, and I live in Ottawa, but I'm a long-suffering Leaf fan, and it was yet another Saturday night when the Leafs had lost, and the bill is coming, and it's clear people are on Facebook, but the notion that you can use social media to not just make people aware, but to actually engage and participate and speak out was still pretty new, and frankly, I didn't really have any great expectations other than, well, we might as well give it a shot. And of course, what we've seen in the intervening years is that it's become such a critical tool, and Ron referred, of course, to it as well, in the way that you can get people previously often in disparate places who weren't otherwise connected to connect. I briefly showed the slide of the Vancouver Facebook group, and I always found it rather amazing. I mean, here was a bunch of people who didn't know one another, right? They just happened to be online and happened to be concerned with copyright. And at the time, I remember taking a look, and here was a community that had found a community space to meet. They had found a bit of structure. They had an agenda. They began identifying local area members of parliament. They had begun to rally, and none of that would have happened but for social media. And so now when I engage, not just for advocacy purposes, but for research dissemination and knowledge translation purposes, for me, social media always a pretty big component, because I want to be able to speak to not just the 50 other academics that are interested in these issues, but to a broader audience, and especially on many of these digital rights issues, there is a broader audience, as long as you can find the avenues and the kind of language to ensure that it's more inclusive research, that they've got the chance to learn and participate.
Brent was nodding in agreement there, and I wonder, as a library director, and you said you have to speak to colleagues in the capacity of your job, how do you go about explaining the changes and breaking it down, the changes that are happening with respect to copyright and other things that are not so easy to understand, but how do you break that down for the various people that I'm sure should be interested in what you do?
It is interesting that there's a surprising amount of incomprehension on how copyright works in terms of the licenses we pay for, in terms of what people as say course instructors, researchers, students can do with copyright protected materials. And it's not simple. It's a little bit arcane, it seems to many people who haven't become immersed in the various questions of copyright. And they eventually get it. I mean, you do need to explain why creators' rights certainly need to be protected, but why there's also rights as users, and both need to be respected, both need to be used, and in terms of our faculty, they're publishing as well, so they have a sense, oh yeah, they may not make a lot in royalties as academic writers, unfortunately for them, most of the time, but they understand that, oh yes, intellectual property is something that is valuable, and it is something that somebody has to pay for to use. But then it's my job to tell them, but there are ways that we can use it effectively. So.
Thank you, Brent. To the CSI of cyberspace now. I love that line. Love it. Change is a constant when it comes to technology and just keeping up with everything in an age where we have the Edward Snowdens of the world. Is it a challenge to do just that and keep up with this ever-changing world and keep on top of it? Ron.
Oh, yes, of course it is. It's part of the challenge of doing research in an area that's so fast moving, and that's part of the character of this ecosystem that we call cyberspace. It's constantly moving and changing and adapting. I think the secret is to, and the luxury that we have, frankly, is to have a large team of people that that cover different aspects of it. We're a very interdisciplinary shop. We have about 12 full-time staff in Toronto and another dozen or so worldwide that we work with, including a lot of the organizations that we collaborate with. And frankly, that's the only way to keep on top of this area, is to have people covering off different areas. And
Power in numbers.
yeah, and I've come to realize as I've gotten older, I think my best skill is almost like a sports team manager or a Broadway producer rather than a researcher. I can identify skill sets and put the right people together to cover off all that needs to be covered off.
Well, obviously you're doing it well.
Thank you.
Eugen, I was really struck by your story, your grandfather and your father, and I wondered, how has your life changed? And in saying that, was it something, I mean, obviously fighting for the justice that you are, was it something that you were born into, or did your life path, your dreams change because of your family situation?
Yeah, like I think as a stateless people, we constantly strive to preserve our stories because there is no government funding it. We constantly strive to preserve it through oral traditions or through advocating. For me, advocating for Tibetan freedom was a means to connect to my identity. It was a means to, respond to what had happened to my grandfather and my father. So, yes, for sure, after coming to Canada, after, really learning about how many avenues there are for advocacy, I was able to do that even more so. I think social media actually has played such a huge role in helping amplify our voices. Before, I mean, we had to really strive to get anything on media, to get the masses to hear it. But today, I could share a video, I could share images online that could get thousands of people without the need of, major corporations behind it. And I think social media has played a huge role there. And like I've said before, people inside Tibet are so adept at, connecting with each other. And it has made our movement so much stronger because of that. There's a saying that always resonates for me when I did my research at OCAD for the evolving design of protest. Information is one of the biggest enemies of a dictatorial regime. With social media, with the internet, information just multiplies at an exponential rate. And that's why dictatorships will come to an end.
Thank you so much, Eugen. Hope you have your questions ready. We're going to open it up to the floor. You'll see that there are microphones at either end of the room. Please feel free to walk right up and ask a question of any of our esteemed panel. Thank you so much. Yeah, you can head right over there.
Hi. Okay, so I know you guys talked a lot about cyber spying and the dangers and how that faces a world that lives on the internet, but how do you guys feel about governments monitoring private information like PRISM and the NSA in their fight against terrorism? Do you feel like there's a certain line in between how much governments should actually monitor our activity, instead of using it for other purposes such as finding or scouting out activists that are actually doing good work? Does that make sense?
It does. Ron sounds like yeah.
Well,
Ron.
and Michael too.
And Michael as well, yes.
We're both very interested in this topic. Do you want to? Okay. So it's an excellent question, and I think that the fact of the matter is liberal democratic societies have not really had a chance to maturely debate this topic in an open, transparent way. The organizations, the agencies that you're talking about were born mostly in the Cold War, among the most highly secretive of agencies, the NSA and its partners around the world. There was a time when those agencies, their missions were primarily oriented at other governments during the Cold War.
Canadian, U.S. signals intelligence agencies, their overarching concern was to monitor what was going on in the Soviet Union, to anticipate a ballistic missile attack, let's say. After 9/11 especially, but it was a general trend, the focus turned inward on all of society because threats have dispersed. And now the primary concern is an individual or a group causing some kind of terrorist attack and engaging in violence. And that is really a paradigm shift of the utmost importance for civil liberties, for discussions about privacy and rights. And we really haven't had that discussion. So as a consequence, these agencies have been able to put in place extraordinarily powerful surveillance apparatuses that essentially collect everything about us at the very same time that we've transformed ourselves in terms of how we communicate. We leave a digital trail wherever we go. We carry in our pockets devices that follow us around and emit a signal not only about where we are in space and time, but with whom we communicate, what websites we visit, and so on. We need to step back and ask a question about what is the proper limits and what type of oversight and accountability do we need to have in a liberal democratic society for those agencies. I believe we will always have those agencies, but we haven't had that discussion yet about oversight, limits, and accountability yet.
Thank you so much for your question. Do we have another? Before I ask another. Going once, going twice?
Everybody wants a beer.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. If there is one tool, gentlemen, that you feel that you need right now in order to continue what you're doing, making a difference, being game changers, what would that be? Something that you don't have at present. Michael, I'd love to start with you.
Well, it's on my wish list. I mean,
wish list.
I must admit, I feel that I've been incredibly fortunate. So I have, as you heard, a Canada Research Chair, and I think I've got an enormously supportive university that frankly, what I need is more time in the day, not more resources right now. But what I think we need more broadly, and it ties into the other question that we heard before, is that we need to have the kinds of discussions that Ron was talking about. I was struck during Ron's presentation that when he was doing some of that amazing work for many years before Snowden, it was always the other, right? It's the UAE that's doing this, or it's the Chinese government that's doing this. And what I think we've learned is that we're doing this, and we're doing this to ourselves. And we're doing it at a scale that I think would shock many. And not only have we not had those discussions, but even just this week, Canadian government, through the committee, passed Bill C-51, so-called anti-terror legislation that opens the door to far broader information sharing with no additional oversight whatsoever. And so I think what I need that conversation. And one way to ensure that people can have that conversation is connectivity. And so if there is another issue that we haven't had a chance to talk about, it's that, especially I think when we're in academic environments, we live a bit of a privileged life where we have seemingly unlimited access. Everyone's got high speed and wireless on campuses, and the notion that there are people that don't have these devices, don't have connectivity, is something that we don't experience much. But there are still many communities across the country that don't have access. There are many kids that go home after school still today without computers in their homes. And I don't understand how a kid can go to high school or middle school and not have a computer to be able to engage and be able to succeed in that environment anymore. That's still what's happening. So how are we going to succeed on these kinds of issues? I think it's to ensure that we have these dialogues and to ensure that everybody has the opportunity to participate, and we're still not there yet.
No, still a ways to go.
There is.
Ron, anything you'd like to add?
Well, that was very eloquent, and I agree with absolutely everything Michael said. I think I would, if I had a wish list, one thing that I think is important is we need to somehow address disciplinary boundaries in the university environment. I think that these act as a barrier to the type of research that needs to happen now for the problems that we face as citizens of the world, whether it's health or the environment or the ones that we're talking about concerning internet rights. I think we need to encourage more interdisciplinary research. Sometimes that's thrown out there in an almost glib, facile way without really understanding what's entailed to bring that type of interdisciplinary research together in an actual live environment. And meanwhile, we are still wedded to these old ways of categorizing the division of academia into silos. Somehow that has to change. I'm fortunate to be at a School of Global Affairs that is interdisciplinary, but schools like that are very rare.
Indeed they are. Brent, anything that you don't have that you still want?
Yeah, I would say that we've been talking about copyright, but one area that is related is the area of open access. And we have a problem with access to scientific and scholarly information in as much as it's very expensive. One way over the long run that situation might be improved is by researchers making their research outputs available on an open access basis. And happily, our own granting agencies have recently put out a policy to encourage this. But you were asking earlier, how does one explain copyright issues? It's actually more interesting to try to explain the concept of open access and what researchers can do to promote that. And often they don't quite see the value of it yet. I think they will. So I guess what I would like is more opportunities to explain, to have the time to explain to them the values that can bring.
I'm so sorry I have to wrap this now. I could talk to you all night. Brent and Ron and Michael and Ugin and Gerald and Kent, thank you so much. Keep changing the world, gentlemen. You're doing a great job. Appreciate you. Thank you.
Let me add my thanks to everyone for participating. To the panelists, to Marcy, thank you for stimulating our neural networks this evening and get us thinking about the kinds of conversations that will always occur as you leave the room, and you've created a fantastic one this evening. So thank you. I'd also like to just make a few comments. One, thank you to our Vice President's Research in the province of Ontario, who have brought together this Research Matters platform to explore things like big ideas. The Research Matters program began about 3 years ago, and each year it changes, but we have everything from yesterday's pop-up research park at Queen's Park to this summer, a curiosity cruiser that will be traveling across the province and visiting local festivals, stimulating the opportunity in those communities to ask questions of our Ontario's researchers, and we actually get back to them with the answers. So thank you for that. The motto of that particular program, of course, is stay curious. And if you want to learn more, please be sure to visit the website yourontarioresearch.ca. Tonight's discussions certainly demonstrate the quality of research and thinking, big thinking that is going on in but a tiny snapshot of our university activity. And it turns out that we've been pretty busy in our environments over the last 100 years. George Dixon, in kicking off tonight's panel, talked about Ontarians getting this chance to vote on 50 historic game-changing discoveries at Ontario universities. And so we hope that all of you here will take the time to participate in that program. I also think it's remiss if we don't thank the Government of Ontario for its ongoing commitment to supporting research excellence in this province, whether it's through the Ontario Research Funds or through the $25 million they invested to endow 13 Ontario research chairs. Today's event wouldn't be possible without that support, and of course that's matched and often supported by the federal government for their continuing commitment to university through the university research through SSHRC and NSERC, CHI, it's an alphabet soup, CFI, I could go on, many, many more, but it's really important that we acknowledge that, and the Canada Research Chairs program has been a game changer in the context of the intellectual development of our country. So thank you to our partners, the Federation for Humanities and Social Sciences, and to Virtual Researcher on Call. Without you, we wouldn't have a kind of interesting couple of days together. On behalf of all of Ontario's universities, thank you for being with us this evening. Tomorrow morning, poster sessions open at 8 a.m. Everyone is welcome. The sessions begin at 8:30. There are panels, there are breakout sessions, there are armchair sessions like this evening on aging tomorrow, and of course over lunch we'll get a chance to talk to each other. So thank you everyone, travel safely this evening, and again thank you to our panelists and to Marcy for doing such an extraordinary job this evening. Thank you.